It was a cold October evening in Carbondale, Illinois, in 2017. Frank Stonemark, a 76-year-old real estate entrepreneur and beloved father of three, was known for his dedication to his family and his work. To the outside world, Frank had everything: a thriving business, a beautiful home, and a wife he adored. Yet on the night of October 30th, he disappeared. That evening, Frank's wife, Carmen Stonemark, called the police. She reported that Frank had stormed out after an argument, driving off in his red minivan. Hours passed, then days. There was no word from Frank, no sightings. His phone went silent, his credit cards untouched. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. Police launched an immediate search. The red minivan was nowhere to be found. They combed through nearby woods, rivers, and highways. Nothing. Frank's children, desperate for answers, begged the public for information. His colleagues and friends couldn't believe it. Frank wasn't the kind of man to simply walk away. At first, investigators treated it as a missing person case, suspecting Frank might have suffered an accident or wandered off in distress. But as days turned into weeks, unease began to grow. Friends described Frank as a careful, methodical man, someone who would never leave without contacting his family. And Carmen? Her demeanor raised questions. She was calm, too calm. Detectives started digging into the Stonemark marriage. On the surface, it looked like a picture-perfect relationship. Frank had married Carmen, a woman 2 decades his junior, after his divorce years earlier. They were frequently seen together at local events, holding hands, smiling for photos. But neighbors whispered that things weren't as perfect as they seemed. Arguments were common, and some recalled seeing Frank with unexplained bruises. As the investigation deepened, police uncovered a chilling discovery. Carmen had been living a double life. Behind Frank's back, she was involved in an affair with James Deese, a man Frank had employed as a handyman. Deese wasn't just another lover. He was someone who had been around the Stonemark home, knew the family, and most disturbingly, had easy access to Frank's life. Detectives pieced together a timeline. Carmen's affair with Deese wasn't new. It had been going on for months, maybe years. The two were seen meeting in secret, exchanging texts, and speaking in hushed tones when Frank wasn't around. But why would Carmen, married to a man with wealth and influence, risk it all for a handyman? And how did this connection tie into Frank's disappearance? As suspicion fell on Carmen and Deese, police turned to Frank's finances. What they found was startling. Bank records showed that in the months leading up to his disappearance, Frank had been taking out large sums of money, loans that seemed out of character for someone with his financial stability. Was Frank in debt, or had he been pressured into giving up his wealth? The case took a shocking turn weeks later when Frank's red minivan was discovered in a remote parking lot in Kentucky, over 100 miles from his home. The vehicle was abandoned, its interior stripped of valuables, but inside, investigators found something that would change the course of the investigation: traces of blood. With this evidence in hand, police shifted their focus entirely to Carmen and Deese. What started as a missing persons investigation had now become something far deeper. Detectives knew one thing for certain: Frank Stonemark hadn't vanished. He had been silenced. What happened to Frank Stonemark, and how far would his wife and her lover go to cover their tracks? Stay with us as we uncover the shocking truth behind a crime that shook a quiet Illinois town to its core. Frank Stonemark was the kind of man people looked up to. A self-made entrepreneur, he built his fortune through years of dedication to his real estate empire in Carbondale, Illinois. Friends described him as meticulous, driven, and deeply passionate about his work. Those who worked with Frank admired his attention to detail, his calm demeanor, and his ability to solve problems with remarkable ease. At 76, Frank should have been enjoying his golden years, spending his days relaxing in the home he'd worked so hard to create. Instead, he was still actively managing his rental properties, refusing to let his age slow him down. He had a reputation as someone who was generous yet firm, known to help tenants in need, but unwilling to tolerate irresponsibility. His personal life, however, was a different story. Frank had been married before, and his first marriage had produced 3 children, all of whom he remained close to. After his divorce, Frank found love again with Carmen, a woman nearly 20 years his junior. The age gap didn't seem to matter in the beginning. Carmen was vibrant, charming, and full of energy, qualities Frank found refreshing. Their marriage began as one filled with love and promise, and Frank was eager to give Carmen the comfortable life he believed she deserved. Carmen Stonemark, on the other hand, had a very different background. Born and raised in Kentucky, she came from a modest upbringing. Her life before meeting Frank had been far from glamorous. Friends from her past described her as ambitious, with a strong desire to escape the hardships of her small-town roots. When she met Frank, he seemed like the answer to her dreams. Their courtship was brief, and they married quickly. Carmen soon settled into the role of a housewife, spending her days managing the household and attending social gatherings alongside Frank. From the outside, it appeared she had everything: wealth, stability, and a husband who adored her. But problems in their relationship began to surface over time. Carmen wasn't content with the quiet, stable life Frank offered. She grew bored and restless, craving the excitement and passion she felt her life lacked. While Frank was focused on his business, Carmen's dissatisfaction with their marriage deepened. She began to spend more time away from home, meeting friends and engaging in hobbies that kept her occupied. It wasn't long before she crossed paths with James Deese. James Deese was a man of humble origins. A handyman by trade, he worked for Frank's business, maintaining properties and handling repairs. He was rugged, charming in his own way, and carried an air of confidence that drew people to him. Though Frank had hired him for his skills and reliability, James harbored resentment toward his employer. He saw Frank as privileged and overly controlling, someone who never truly appreciated the hard work of people like him. James also had a reputation for being something of a ladies' man, and when he met Carmen, their chemistry was undeniable. Their affair began subtly, almost innocently, a conversation here, a shared laugh there. But it quickly escalated into something more. Carmen found in James the excitement and thrill she felt her marriage was missing. He, in turn, saw Carmen as an escape from his mundane life. Their secret meetings became more frequent, and soon they were consumed by the relationship. While Frank worked tirelessly to provide for his family, Carmen and James were plotting their moments together, often using Frank's own properties as their rendezvous points. But this was no ordinary affair. Carmen and James weren't just in love, they were scheming. Over time, their conversations shifted from stolen kisses and whispered promises to discussions about a future together. There was only one obstacle standing in their way: Frank. To Carmen, Frank had become a burden, a man whose presence kept her from living the life she truly wanted. For James, Frank was a symbol of everything he despised: wealth, authority, and power. Their motives began to align. For Carmen, it was about freedom and the potential inheritance she would receive upon Frank's death. For James, it was about taking what he believed he deserved. Together, they hatched a plan that would rid them of Frank and give them everything they wanted. Carmen's dissatisfaction with her marriage wasn't entirely unnoticed. Frank's children and friends had noticed changes in her behavior over the years. She was distant, often avoiding family gatherings or making excuses to be elsewhere. Frank himself seemed weary, as though the weight of his personal life was beginning to take a toll on him. He confided in a few close friends that his marriage wasn't as happy as it once was. But he never suspected the depth of Carmen's betrayal. Financial records would later reveal that Frank had been under increasing pressure in the months leading up to his disappearance. He had been taking out loans and selling off assets, unusual behavior for a man who had always been financially prudent. When questioned by friends, Frank dismissed their concerns, attributing his actions to temporary cash flow issues. But investigators would later suspect that Carmen and James had been manipulating Frank, perhaps even coercing him into parting with his money. As their affair continued, Carmen and James grew bolder. They began discussing the logistics of their plan, weighing the risks and rewards. Carmen reassured James that Frank's death would be seen as an accident or a case of natural causes. She believed that, as his wife, she would inherit his wealth without suspicion. James, emboldened by Carmen's promises, agreed to carry out the plan. What neither of them accounted for was the complexity of their crime and the attention it would draw. Carmen underestimated Frank's children, who would stop at nothing to find out what had happened to their father. James, for all his confidence, was careless in ways that would later come back to haunt him. Together, they believed they could outsmart everyone, but their arrogance would ultimately be their undoing. As the investigation into Frank's disappearance continued, detectives began to unravel the web of lies that Carmen and James had spun. Witnesses came forward, describing suspicious behavior, secretive meetings, and heated arguments. One by one, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Carmen and James thought they had planned the perfect crime. What they didn't realize was that their actions had left a trail, one that would lead investigators straight to the truth. On the surface, Carmen and James had planned meticulously. They believed their scheme would play out without a hitch, eliminating Frank from their lives while granting them a life of wealth and freedom. The whispers of their secret conversations revealed a cold, calculated plan to end Frank Stonemark's life, a plan born from greed and resentment. James Deese took the lead on the logistics. His experience as a handyman and his familiarity with the Stonemark properties gave him an intimate understanding of their surroundings. Carmen, meanwhile, provided the necessary access and the assurances that Frank's absence would be easily explained. Their communication during this time was constant, text messages laced with code words and veiled references to the act they were about to commit. In one message to James, Carmen reportedly wrote, "It has to be done soon. I'm ready for us to be free." The date was set, October 30th, 2017. James would carry out the act, and Carmen would ensure that Frank's disappearance appeared routine, a minor argument that led him to storm out of the house. Their plan relied on precision, on every detail aligning perfectly. They thought they had left nothing to chance. In the days leading up to the crime, Frank was in his usual routine. He spent his mornings managing tenant issues, his afternoons at the local diner for coffee, and his evenings at home with Carmen. But those close to him noticed subtle changes. He seemed unusually withdrawn, and there was a fatigue about him that was hard to miss. Frank's daughter later told investigators that her father had confided in her about arguments with Carmen, but never elaborated. "He wasn't the type to complain," she said. "He just kept things to himself." On the evening of October 30th, Frank came home early after a day of meetings. According to Carmen's later account, they had dinner together, though the atmosphere was tense. An argument erupted over finances, an issue that had become increasingly frequent in their household. Frank, exasperated, reportedly told Carmen he was tired of being treated as an ATM. Carmen, playing her part, let the argument escalate, knowing it would provide the perfect cover for what was to come. James Deese arrived later that evening, under the guise of checking on a maintenance issue in one of Frank's properties. Carmen had arranged for him to meet her in their garage, where the two finalized their plan. The tools James had brought weren't for fixing anything. They were for ending a life. Dressed in dark clothing, he waited for Carmen to signal that the moment was right. Frank was in the living room, seated in his favorite chair, watching the evening news. It was a scene of complete normalcy, a quiet ending to an otherwise unremarkable day. What Frank didn't know was that James was just a few steps away, waiting for the opportunity to strike. Carmen called out to Frank from the kitchen, asking him to come help her with something. As Frank stood and walked toward the sound of her voice, James emerged from the shadows. What happened next was brutal and swift. Using a makeshift garrote fashioned from a length of wire, James attacked Frank from behind, pulling the wire tightly around his neck. Frank struggled, clawing at the wire and trying to free himself, but James was relentless. Carmen stood nearby, watching, her face a mask of cold detachment. The struggle lasted minutes, but felt like an eternity. By the time it was over, Frank's body lay lifeless on the floor. James and Carmen stood in silence, catching their breath, the weight of what they had done sinking in. But there was no time for reflection. They had to act quickly to cover their tracks. The next phase of their plan was just as chilling. Using tools James had brought with him, they dismembered Frank's body in the garage, carefully packing the remains into garbage bags. Carmen worked methodically, wiping down surfaces and ensuring there were no traces of blood or evidence that could implicate them. James, ever confident in his ability to outsmart authorities, reassured her. "No one's going to find anything," he reportedly said. "This is done." With the remains secured in the back of Frank's red minivan, James and Carmen drove to a remote location in Kentucky, over 100 miles from their home. They chose an isolated area near a wooded lot, believing it would be the perfect place to dispose of the evidence. There, they burned the remains in a fire pit, watching as the flames consumed the last traces of Frank Stonemark. To further obscure the crime, they abandoned the van in a nearby parking lot, ensuring that it appeared as though Frank had left voluntarily and met with misfortune elsewhere. By the time they returned to Carbondale, it was the early hours of October 31st. Carmen called the police later that morning, reporting Frank missing and recounting their argument from the previous evening. She played the role of the concerned wife flawlessly, her voice steady and composed as she described how Frank had driven off in anger and never returned. She even contacted Frank's children, feigning worry and asking if they had heard from him. When Frank Stonemark's disappearance was first reported, the investigation started as any other missing person case. Detectives followed standard procedure, interviewing family members, friends, and neighbors, hoping for clues about his whereabouts. Carmen Stonemark, as the spouse, was naturally their first point of contact. She maintained a calm, collected demeanor, recounting her story of an argument that caused Frank to leave the house in frustration. But detectives couldn't shake the feeling that something about her narrative didn't quite add up. The first red flag came during their initial interview with Carmen. When asked about Frank's state of mind before his disappearance, she painted him as agitated and overwhelmed with financial stress. However, Frank's children provided a different account. They described him as cautious, financially stable, and unlikely to make rash decisions. This contradiction, though small, planted a seed of doubt in the minds of investigators. As detectives entered deeper into the case, their attention turned to James Deese, the handyman who had worked closely with Frank. Witnesses had reported seeing James at the Stonemark home the night Frank disappeared, despite Carmen's claim that he hadn't been there. When questioned, James initially denied being involved, insisting he had been at home that evening. But something about his answers felt rehearsed, as if he were walking a tightrope, careful not to say too much. The turning point came with the discovery of Frank's abandoned red minivan in a remote Kentucky parking lot. Investigators were meticulous in their search of the vehicle, and what they found inside changed the trajectory of the case. Traces of blood were discovered on the van's upholstery, and forensic analysis confirmed it was Frank's. This discovery elevated the case from a missing person investigation to a suspected homicide. With this new evidence in hand, detectives returned to Carmen for further questioning. This time, her calm exterior began to crack. She stumbled over her words when asked about the timeline of Frank's disappearance, providing conflicting details that only deepened investigators' suspicions. Detectives noted her lack of emotional response when discussing her husband's possible fate, a stark contrast to the concern shown by Frank's children and friends. Meanwhile, forensic teams began examining financial records and phone data. They discovered that in the months leading up to Frank's disappearance, Carmen had made several large cash withdrawals from their joint accounts, transactions that Frank's children insisted he would never have approved. Even more damning was the phone data. Text messages between Carmen and James revealed a secret relationship filled with discussions of a future together and veiled references to handling the situation. Detectives now had a clearer picture of what had happened, but they needed more evidence to build a solid case. They turned to the local community, interviewing neighbors and employees who might have seen or heard something unusual. One neighbor recalled hearing loud noises and what sounded like an argument on the night Frank disappeared. Another reported seeing James's truck parked outside the Stonemark home late that evening, well past his usual working hours. These accounts added weight to the growing suspicion that Carmen and James were involved in Frank's disappearance. The pressure mounted when investigators discovered surveillance footage from a gas station near the Kentucky parking lot where Frank's van was found. The footage showed James and Carmen together, purchasing gasoline and other items consistent with the tools used to dispose of Frank's remains. This was a critical piece of evidence, placing both suspects near the scene where key parts of their plan had unfolded. When James was brought in for further questioning, his confidence began to waver. Confronted with the evidence against him, phone records, surveillance footage, and witness statements, he started to break. Detectives noticed his body language shift, fidgeting hands, darting eyes, and long pauses before answering questions. It was clear he was struggling to keep his story straight. Eventually, James cracked under the weight of the evidence. In a chilling confession, he detailed the entire plot, from Carmen's initial suggestion to the night of the murder. He described how Carmen had convinced him that Frank was standing in the way of their happiness, that his removal was the only path forward. James admitted to strangling Frank, dismembering his body, and working with Carmen to burn the remains in an attempt to erase any trace of their crime. James's confession was damning, but Carmen continued to deny her involvement. She claimed James was lying, that he had acted alone, and she had no knowledge of his plans. Detectives weren't convinced. The text messages, financial transactions, and witness testimonies painted a very different picture, one of a calculated, collaborative effort to eliminate Frank. Carmen's arrest came shortly after James's confession. The dramatic moment was captured on a neighbor's cell phone as police arrived at the Stonemark home, handcuffing her in front of stunned onlookers. Even as she was led away, Carmen maintained her innocence, insisting she had been framed. The courtroom became the stage for a trial that captivated the community. Prosecutors presented their case with chilling precision, laying out the evidence piece by piece. The text messages between Carmen and James were read aloud, revealing the cold, methodical planning that had gone into the crime. Surveillance footage placed the pair at critical locations, and James's confession provided a detailed account of their actions. One of the most damning moments of the trial came when a forensic expert testified about the blood found in Frank's van. The expert explained how the patterns indicated a violent struggle, leaving no doubt that Frank had met a brutal end. Family members wept as the details were recounted, the reality of Frank's fate hitting them all over again. The trial of Carmen Stonemark and James Deese captivated the small Illinois community, drawing widespread media attention and turning the courthouse into a hub of public fascination. Journalists, true crime enthusiasts, and curious onlookers packed the courtroom each day, eager to witness the unfolding drama. At the heart of it all was the question that gripped everyone. How could a wife and her lover conspire to murder a man like Frank Stonemark? The prosecution wasted no time painting a damning picture of Carmen and James. In their opening statement, they laid out the motive in stark terms: greed and desire. Assistant District Attorney Megan Harper described how Carmen, unhappy in her marriage and enamored with James, saw Frank's wealth as the ticket to a life of freedom and indulgence. James, harboring resentment toward Frank and lured by the promise of financial gain, became her willing accomplice. Together, they plotted a crime so calculated and brutal that it left even seasoned investigators shaken. Central to the prosecution's case was the mountain of evidence they had meticulously pieced together. They presented financial records showing large withdrawals from Frank's accounts, which Carmen had orchestrated under the guise of household expenses. They introduced text messages exchanged between Carmen and James, revealing coded discussions about their plans. The messages were read aloud in court, their contents chillingly casual. "It'll be over soon." One text from Carmen to James read, "We just need to stick to the plan." Surveillance footage played a crucial role in cementing their guilt. Jurors watched video clips of Carmen and James purchasing supplies from a gas station near the disposal site in Kentucky. One piece of footage showed James carrying a canister of gasoline, while Carmen appeared to scan the area nervously. The prosecution argued that this was part of their effort to destroy evidence after the murder. Perhaps the most damning testimony came from a forensic pathologist who analyzed the traces of blood found in Frank's van. The expert explained in detail how the blood patterns indicated a violent struggle, likely consistent with strangulation and subsequent transport of the body. The jury listened intently, their expressions grim as they absorbed the graphic details. In a dramatic moment, The prosecution called one of Frank's children to the stand. His eldest daughter, her voice trembling but resolute, described her father as a kind, hard-working man who had given Carmen everything she could have wanted. He trusted her, she said, tears streaming down her face. He believed she loved him, and she repaid that trust with betrayal. The sentencing hearing was equally emotional. Frank's children addressed the court, speaking directly to Carmen. "You didn't just take our father," one said, her voice breaking. "You took away our sense of trust, our sense of security. We will never forgive you for what you've done." The judge, in delivering his sentence, did not hold back. This was a crime fueled by greed, deception, and a complete lack of regard for human life, he said. "You violated the most sacred bonds of trust and love, and for that, you will spend the rest of your lives in prison." Both Carmen and James received life sentences without the possibility of parole. For Frank's children, the loss of their father was a devastation that words couldn't adequately describe. They had to grapple not only with the reality of his brutal death, but also with the betrayal of someone they had once welcomed into their family. "It's hard to even begin to process what happened," one of his daughters said years later. "We lost our dad, but we also lost a sense of safety in the world. If someone like Carmen could do this, who can you really trust?" The impact on the local community was profound as well. Carbondale, a town known for its close-knit, quiet nature, became a place of unease. Neighbors questioned whether they truly knew the people living next door, and the story sparked countless conversations about the darker side of human relationships. "It was shocking," one resident recalled. "We always thought things like this happened somewhere else, to other people, but it happened here, to someone we all knew." Could the murder of Frank Stonemark have been prevented? That's a question many have asked in the years since the case concluded. Looking back, there were subtle signs: Carmen's growing dissatisfaction, her withdrawal from family events, and Frank's uncharacteristic financial decisions. But hindsight is always clearer than the present. The truth is, Frank likely never imagined that the woman he loved and trusted would conspire against him in such a way. For him, the betrayal wasn't just unforeseeable, it was unimaginable. Justice may have been served in the courtroom, but the emotional scars remain. For those left behind, the pain lingers, a stark reminder of the fragility of trust and the devastating consequences of betrayal. Frank's family continues to honor his memory, hoping that his story serves as both a warning and a call to action to cherish and protect the relationships that matter most. What do you think about this case? Was justice served? Could you ever imagine a love so toxic it leads to murder? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And thank you for joining us as we uncovered the tragic story of Frank Stonemark.